Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon for those that may be further east of the Eastern Time Zone. I'm Al Young, professor at the University of Michigan and associate director of the Center for Social Solutions, the home of the Scholars Network on Masculinity and the Well-Being of African American Men. It is my pleasure today to welcome you to a very special opportunity for us to broaden our perspective on Black masculinities, to go beyond the national context and think globally, and to move beyond an intensive preoccupation with concern, despair, problems, and issues, and talk more about justice and healing, a more positive dimension of thinking about Black men and boys across the globe. Today, we are honored to have Esther Armah presenting on moving masculinity, emotional justice for Black men. You've received the extensive write-up on the distinctions that Ms. Armah has achieved as an artist, a scholar, an intellectual, a public figure. So I will not take most of our valuable time today in elaborating upon those achievements. I will simply say that as an award-winning journalist, filmmaker, playwright, and CEO, she has done an extraordinary effort, contributed an extraordinary effort to helping us understand Black masculinity in context that makes sense for the modern world. She's the author of Emotional Justice, A Roadmap for Racial Healing, and a series of additional works that speak to a contemporary vision for Black masculinity. She's worked throughout the world, so busy that I'm not sure where in the world she is today, although I know she's on our screen before us. And among some of her more recent accomplishments, she's a 2024 Soros Equity Fellow, where she continues to advance and develop her work. I will turn it over to Ms. Armah for our presentation today, and near the end of our presentation, we'll facilitate a Q&A opportunity. Esther, please
Thank,
take it away.
thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Al. Hello, everybody. In context, because Al referred to the fact that he doesn't know where in the world I am. Right now, I am on the west coast of Africa. I'm in Ghana, in the capital city of Accra. And then in a week, I will be on the East Coast in the US, in New York and New Jersey. So definitely bouncing around. And I just came back from South Africa doing some work there. So it's really a pleasure to be joined to join you and to be in conversation. Um, I'm going to walk through this presentation. It's going to marry storytelling, analysis, and information. That's kind of how I move. And I had some technical issues, so you'll hear me saying next slide, next slide. That's just me requesting Al or Sarah shows up the next slide so that we can keep it moving. So this presentation is called Moving Masculinity. It is the name of a project on global Black masculinities and emotional justice for Black men. So thank you for joining me. Next slide, please. So we're going to be talking about threesomes, as I like to say, but not that kind. Emotional inheritance, emotional terrorism, and emotional infrastructure. Those really are the elements that make up the framework, emotional justice, and original racial healing framework that I created and which I'm going to get into. But we're going to start with emotional inheritance. Next slide, please. So my name is Esther Akesi Armah. Esther is my first name, Akesi is my middle name, and Armah is my last name. So the Akesi and the Armah come from my father's tribe. You'll see the picture on my far right, the man holding the mic, the man with his hands out, that's my pops, God rest his beautiful soul. He's in the middle as well, where you see his little handkerchief and his white shirt. And he's on the far left. That's my dad with my mother, my two daughters. The other man is important as well. The other man is a man who my father would describe as a father to him. But he's also Ghana's first post-liberation president, President Kwame Nkrumah. So emotional inheritance is a critical part of the work that I do. And I define it as individual, familial, communal, national, global, racial, and tribal. It literally shapes us. It shapes how we move through the world. It shapes how we see ourselves, and it shapes how we walk through this particular space. Now, in terms of my emotional inheritance, as I said, my name is Esther A, Armah, which is a story of what shapes me and my emotional inheritance. Akesi is my middle name, comes from the tribe, the Nzuma tribe of Ghana. That's what the tribe of my father. And Akesi means I was born on Sunday. My last name is Armah. Armah is a Ga name. Ga is a very proud tribe also of Ghana. And my dad is a proud Ga man. Ga is one of his mother tongues, his languages, along with Twi, which is the local language of Ghana, and English. And these images are storytellers of the masculinities that shape me. My father was somebody who was born into colonial Ghana, but lived to be an activist and participate in the liberatory fight for independence, and was very honored and proud to serve his country, our country, Ghana, working with the president, which is Kwame Nkrumah, who you see in these images. Kwame Nkrumah was like a father to him. Emotional inheritance is a critical part of my work because it's about exploring that we rarely show up. Even if we're showing up individually, we don't actually stand as individuals. That we are shaped by those, of course, who gave birth to us, our parents, but also the heritage and the lineage that they come from. That we are a communal people as global Black people, that it is also a national, a global, a racial, and a tribal inheritance. And this really reflects my approach to emotions and emotionality, that it is a structural reality. So often, the world of the emotions is individualized and gendered as a way to dismiss it as not having a critical role either in shaping suppression, perpetuating oppression, or being a contributing factor to dismantling oppression and the role in healing. But in my work, all of those things show up. So the picture on the far left is my dad and Kwame Nkrumah, the two little Black girls, and my two elder sisters, and that beautiful lady is my mother. I'm also of the Ashanti tribe of Ghana, and the Ashanti is a matrilineal tribe. For the purposes of this presentation, because I'm specifically talking about masculinity, you'll hear me refer to and speak about the tribe of the Nzima and the Ga that shape me. Al talked about my globality, and I self-identify as a global Black chick. And by that, I mean I claim 3 cities in 3 countries across 3 continents as home. I was born in London, that's the city of my birth, and went to school there. So I'm very much shaped by Britain, Black Britain, which is the home of a lot of folks from the islands, from the Caribbean, as well as West Africa, specifically Ghana and Nigeria, but other nations across the continent as well. I lived and worked in New York for almost 10 years, so very much shaped by the African American experience. I now live in Accra, Ghana, and which is the home of my spirit and my emotional home. London is the city of my birth. New York is the city of my creativity. Accra is the city of spirit and home. The reason why I mention them, though, is global Blackness is the lens through which I do all the work that I do. It's never just singular, it's never just one place, it's always globally informed and globally connected. So that as I engage with you on issues of masculinity, I come with an emotional inheritance. I don't just speak from my own personal experience. I am carried by those who have shaped how I move through the world, how I see myself, and the reality of race in the context of colonialism, in the context of liberation, and with the cities that I claim as home, the legacies of enslavement, and the movements that revolutionized and liberated us as a global Black people. Next slide, please. Emotional inheritance is critical because it is about the passing down. We think of inheritance, we think of it in terms of features, physicality, what we can tangibly hold. But emotional inheritance, it's the passing down of emotional expression, of suppression, of the way that men negotiate a path of survival, a means of protection, a process of deflection, and the management of trauma. If I were to go around this entire room and ask each person to tell me their full name and the story of their name, who named them, and to connect that specifically to the men of their family, part of the inheritance that is passed down is not simply what they were told, because emotionality isn't always about knowing. It is about a lived experience, how that lived experience was managed, how the multiple experiences that shaped that life, how they were negotiated. And so much of that is then passed down. And even if it isn't passed in words, it becomes instinct and triggers and elements of what shapes each of us in our own particular way. For global Black people, we have an emotional inheritance that is rooted in the contemporary systems of enslavement, colonialism, and apartheid that shape our contemporary world. And then for the continent, we have an inheritance that predates colonialism, enslavement, and apartheid. So you have this complex mix of freedom and humanity, as well as the dehumanization, the violence, and the violation from the systems that shape our contemporary world. All of those things make up the emotional inheritance that shows up in how we see ourselves and how we move through the world. It is an inheritance for Black people. It is also an inheritance for white people. And you'll hear me refer to what I call the language of whiteness, the part that also shapes our Blackness because of the systems of harm that have shaped the contemporary world in which we live and the landscape that we navigate. Next slide, please. So emotional inheritance, as I said, is a critical part of emotional justice. And emotional justice is an original racial healing framework. It is about identifying a legacy of untreated trauma that shapes society, that shapes how we see ourselves, how we see each other, and how we move through the world. It specifically gives language to the emotional world of oppression and our liberation movements. And it names the emotional as both racialized and structural, but not individual. Again, as I said before, the individualization of emotions and emotionality has really been a way to dismiss and disregard their power in both sustaining oppressive systems, but then the role that they can play in the dismantling of those and in creating sustainable healing practices that I'm also going to speak about. It identifies and names a healing practice that's about supporting sustainable transformation. When I talk about a legacy of untreated trauma, the specificity of that language is critical because it's not just that it's trauma, because trauma that is treated can also transform how you move through the space. This is about the fact that this is trauma that happened, that it's trauma that comes with legacy, that trauma has been untreated, and therefore all of those things collectively shape the society in which we live, shape us, shape our communities, and shape our family. We very often had legislation for our freedoms. We've had civil infrastructure and legal infrastructure to articulate a motion from enslavement to freedom, whether that's the Civil Rights Act in America, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, the freedom movements in the UK, the liberation movements in Ghana. We've had these movements, these specific things that are physical, that are tangible, that are rational, that we can point to, that have articulated and illuminated how we've moved from one space to the other. The legacy of untreated trauma is manifest in how we see ourselves, how we move through the world, and how society continues to engage and treat Black masculinity. Next slide, please. So the story of emotional justice is that it really was a global journey that was built through research, assignment, and community engagement. It took 15 years across 6 different cities in 3 different countries and 3 different continents. The reason, again, that I highlight that is that the lens through which I do my work is global Blackness. And it's a very specific centering of emotional justice within a global Blackness lens. Because of, as I break down and explain how it came to be and the journeys that I went through. The assignments are especially critical because there were 3 assignments in 1997 in Accra, in Philadelphia, and in Cape Town. In Accra, it was the 40-year anniversary of independence And it would be the first time that I would hear the story of the 1966 coup, but told by my mother, where recently it had been told by my father. So it was very much about a broken silence within the family and what that broken silence held. My father was somebody who was a political prisoner, so he was incarcerated. And what I learned through my trips to Accra was that my dad was a man who was shaped by deep loss and deep grief, unexpressed, unhealed grief. He was born to he lost his mother at birth and then he lost his twin. So loss deeply shaped him as a boy who became a man. And that loss remained unexpressed in multiple ways, but it manifested in the way that he parented his children. And that's what I mean when I talk about emotional inheritance. So there are experiences some of our parents have. I didn't know that my father had so much loss, but I had always noted a clear fear of a certain level of connection and the expectation that things would be gone in ways that never made sense. And when he shared the losses that had shaped his boyhood, those things started to make sense. What I'm inviting us to consider is that Black masculinities are shaped by forces known and unknown, but the manifestation of those inheritances come up, whether in how we parent and how we engage or how we communicate. In Philadelphia, I would meet Winnie Mandela, who was part of a force rejecting the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process in South Africa. In South Africa in 1997, there was a massive outpouring of this notion that healing was this hold hands kind of kumbaya, everybody come together and everybody get along. Really, though, it was about the Black emotional forgiveness of white supremacist violence. And it created a model around emotionality and forgiveness when it came to race that really centered the feelings, the anxiety, and the concerns of whiteness and the expected emotional labor of Blackness. Worse than that, it timelined and deadlined healing from systems of harm that disregarded not just the fact of the harm, because apartheid legislated deviance, it legislated harm, but the legacy from that legislation, the generations who were impacted by that. So whilst apartheid in terms of its legislated space was 48 years, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was 9. And so this idea that there is a deadline and a timeline for which Black folk get to do their healing, no matter the length of time that the harm has been sustained, would become a model where there would be an expectation of Black emotional labor and Black forgiveness of white supremacist violence. And there was always the question of, do we forgive the violence that has been perpetrated against Black bodies by white supremacist forces? In Cape Town, I had the opportunity to interview Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was considered an icon of forgiveness and very much helped me begin to articulate that there is a role that masculinity plays in how we have thought about and engaged trauma, but we haven't put language to it. What do I mean by that? In the systems of harm in South Africa, specifically apartheid, in the States with enslavement and with colonialism, there was an emotional relationship to power when it came to whiteness and masculinity that was all about dominion, subjugation, and had nothing to do with development. Because the bodies over which dominion were held were Black, it meant that masculinity was always about dominion over a body that was not your own. So the emotional relationship to power was about control and not community. There is a legacy to the untreated trauma of that for us as a global human family. It taught white men that their emotional connection to power wasn't just dominion, but that they were the leaders. That leadership was not just title, it was essence, it was identity. And that same learning given to Black folk and to Black masculinity is that you are always the learners. It is you who needs to learn, who needs to change, who needs to act. It's your behavior that requires change. And if you would simply do the change that is required of you, we would have a peaceful world. Now, all of us call bullshit on that history, but that doesn't mean the emotional connection to that legacy did not shape us in very particular and powerful ways. So it was 15 years. It was in journalism in London, assignments, 40 years of independence in Accra, and hearing the stories of what happened with the coups and my father's incarceration. In Philadelphia, it was the opportunity of meeting Winnie Mandela and have her talk to me about the importance of listening to South African women, as well as interviewing South African men. It was then interviewing Desmond Tutu and Steve Biko's widow, Nkosinathi Biko. Steve Biko was the father of Black consciousness in South Africa, and learning that Nkosinathi Biko actually sued the South African government for a process that she said required justice. So what it led me to and helped me understand was that even when something was as deeply emotional as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was, that emotionality, when it came to Black folks and white supremacy, it needed a justice element. And that's how the language of emotional justice came to be. In New York, with that understanding and seeing how in South Africa, there was very much a centering of white emotionality and white concern and white economic anxiety, and very much an expectation of Black emotional labor. With that knowing, when I moved to New York and I held this years of dialogues that were specifically centering global Blackness and exploring our legacies, the inheritance of our families, and how masculinity was shaped by the Black men within our community and family, but the inheritance that was also societal, it was national, it was global, and it was political. Next slide, please. So the language of whiteness, it's a narrative that teaches Black, brown, and white people who you are and your role in the world. And as I alluded to in the previous slide, it teaches white people that they're the leaders, that they are the saviors, and they're the knowers, and they're the teachers. And it teaches Black people that they are learners, eternal students. So it's a binary that's more than title or label, that it becomes essence, part of the emotional economy of your identity. And it's more than a lesson, it's enforced and it's entrenched. So when you have an emotional relationship to something, it's different than an intellectual understanding of it or a philosophy around it or an ideology around it, because the intellectualization helps develop a rational understanding of what is problematic. But the emotional relationship to it is about something completely different. It's about how it shapes you and how it shows up within you in ways that may not seem either rational and are not intellectual, but they are certainly real and they're certainly powerful. So it manifests in how you see yourself, how we see each other, and how we move through the world. That is a shared inheritance. And again, it manifests in the ways that we see each other. The language of whiteness is a critical part of what shapes Black masculinity in our contemporary time. Next slide, please. So what I wanted to do was give language to the emotionality that perpetuates oppression and has helped sustain the harm, even though we've had legacies of infrastructure, whether that's legal or civil, that was about dismantling the harm of enslavement and apartheid and colonialism. So this is the language that we created, that there were 4 elements of what we call the language of whiteness, this narrative that teaches you your role and who you are in the world and what it is you're supposed to be, not just do, but who you're supposed to be. So 1 is racialized emotionality, 2 is emotional patriarchy, 3 is emotional currency, and 4 is emotional economy. Each one of them has a definition, but for the purposes of today and our focus on Black masculinity, we're going to talk specifically about racialized emotionality. Next slide, please. Let's define it. So racialized emotionality, it's a world where we take universal emotions. To feel, to have emotions is universal and it's human. But we add gender, color, context, and consequences. So the universal becomes racialized, the racialized becomes dehumanized, and the dehumanized become the ongoing targets of violence. So what does that mean? Everybody feels anger. It's a human emotion. But you put anger in the body of a black man, then now you've added color. Now there's a context to that anger that is societal, that is historical, that is racial. And what are the consequences? The consequences are that you now become perceived as a threat. You now become perceived as dangerous, even though what you're actually doing is having a human experience of feeling an emotion in response to whatever that particular circumstance might be. But what does racialized emotionality do? The dehumanization of your body as a black man means that you have to end up doing what I call emotional shape shifting. If it's not safe for your anger to be expressed, even though it's human, who do you have to become in order to control the anger, in order to protect your body or protect your reality? That type of emotional shape shifting is actually the practice of ongoing dehumanization. It is how this legacy of untreated trauma ends up being sustained. Because when you feel an emotion, you feel it, you expel it, you express it, and then you release it. But if it's not safe to express it because of the consequences of that expression, then where does that emotion go? If you swallow it, if you suppress it, it's in your body. Once it's in your body, what is happening to it? We know that unexpressed emotion can metastasize inside of you. It's part of the legacy of that untreated trauma. So racialized emotionality is a critical part of what shapes Black masculinity. Another one that matters is idea of vulnerability. Vulnerability is a human emotion. And yet, you put vulnerability in the body of a black man. The societal response to somebody who is vulnerable is a collective empathy. But that's not what happens. So often, when black men are vulnerable, the response is a force. The response is violence and violation, because the masculinity is always about dominion, having control over somebody. And so that is part of the language of the elements of the language of whiteness. Next slide, please. So I talked specifically about South Africa and this idea of emotionality and race. So these three images, this is Desmond Tutu on the far left, Winnie Mandela in the center, and William de Klerk on the far right. So when it came to Black masculinity and the forces of white supremacy, this idea of dominion, whiteness, and masculinity was a critical part of how white men expressed and understood their power. But it also meant it became a way that black men also understood and expressed their power. So these three images represent a post apartheid, at least the political apartheid reality. Winnie Mandela was asked by Desmond Tutu publicly to apologize during the height of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. If you remember, the TRC were these global, no, they weren't global, they were globally televised hearings where Black South Africans would come and share the atrocities that they'd experienced at the hands of apartheid. And as long as they told the full story, they were then automatically given amnesty and they were essentially forgiven. Now, that didn't mean that they necessarily told the full truth. And we know with the scenario with Steve Biko that, and in Nkosinati Biko, the full truth was not told, but those officers who sought amnesty for the murder of Steve Biko received it because of the structure of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Desmond Tutu was considered an icon of forgiveness, and he publicly required that Winnie Mandela publicly apologize. The reason William de Klerk is there, William de Klerk was the prime minister who presided over the apartheid system. Neither he nor any other white man was ever asked to apologize for the horror that was apartheid. The only person that was asked was Winnie Mandela. Winnie Mandela. The reason that I have these images up is because part of the legacy of untreated trauma of Black masculinity is looking for ways to reclaim your masculinity and to reclaim your power. But one of the ways that that has too often happened has been on the bodies and on the backs of Black women. And in this case, Winnie Mandela was publicly humiliated and globally castigated. And that experience was ushered in by the request by Desmond Tutu that she publicly apologized. The only person from the ANC who was asked to do that. I offer that as an example of this legacy of untreated trauma that shows up and shapes Black masculinity in ways that cause harm both to Black men, but also to the communities that they are part of. William de Klerk, on the other hand, got a Nobel Peace Prize. Go figure. Next slide, please. So emotional terrorism. One of the elements of the systems of harm that shape our society is this idea that actually feelings are not simply part of your humanity. They are tools and they are weapons to be harnessed in order to justify deadly violence. And I call it emotional terrorism. And the terrorism of Black masculinity is not a single act that has an experience, it has an incident, it has an end, and then we keep moving. No, it has been part of this entire legacy from the what I call the manufactured contentment that was required of Black men during enslavement. So this idea that being subjugated physically, white folks needed to justify their harm by creating narratives that Black people were actually happy. And what Black people learned and what Black men learned was to do what I call manufacture the contentment as a life-saving, as a survival technique. But it's actually emotional terrorism. It's harnessing and weaponizing emotions in order to justify levels of violence that continue to traumatize and have a legacy to this day. Next slide, please. So we say it's the racializing and weaponizing of emotions and history to manufacture threat in order to justify violence. This idea of manufactured threat is critical. So what emotions are weaponized? Fear and threat. Manufactured fear and manufactured threat. There has always been this language that Black men are pathologized as people to be scared of. They represent just by their physicality and their bodies as threat. But these are all manufactured in order to justify violence. But what they also do is they sustain a cycle of dehumanization that hurts Black men and their humanity in ways that is too often not articulated. Next slide, please. So the language of whiteness leads to emotional terrorism, and it creates a Black masculinity that is both haunted and hunted. It's haunted by a history that continues to shape it, and it's hunted because whilst there's been an end to formal notions of enslavement, the legacies of those things continue in powerful and dangerous ways. Next slide, please. So what do we say about it? Terrorism? We do not, cannot, must not negotiate with emotional terrorists. That is a critical part of not allowing the narrative of manufactured threat or manufactured fear to dominate so that it actually transforms how you move through space, because survival has been the mission and mantra for Black people across the world when it comes to forces of white supremacy and their legacies. So even though I'm in Ghana, the legacies continue. So you may be surrounded by Blackness, but the legacies of white supremacy sustain and continue. Next slide, please. So what do? We need emotional infrastructure. The emotional terrorism and emotional inheritance are part of an emotional infrastructure, a part of how emotionality is structural and how it shapes the world in which we live. But because it is also infrastructure, it means that it can actually be harnessed as a critical tool of healing. So I want to talk about how we use that. Next slide, please. So Emotional infrastructure within emotional justice, it's the skeleton on which the meat of philosophy, ideology, and politics is built and then sustained. But that skeleton is harm and healing. The language of whiteness is the emotional infrastructure of harm. It is inheritance and initiation. It is not taught, it's enforced. When we talk about harm and healing, you cannot heal a harm you don't name. And in the context of Black masculinity, that harm must be healed in the context of history. So with emotional justice, we talk about healing harm and heeding history. You cannot heal a harm you don't name, and you must heal it within the context of a history that must be heeded. So in other words, we've had these systems of harm and oppression that have spanned generations. And now we're dealing with a legacy of what has been created that continues to shape us. Next slide, please. So what do? Emotional justice is about naming and identifying the harm and then offering a healing practice through naming and through resource creation. We call it emotional literacy, the development of that. Next slide, please. We're going to break down how we do that. We created love languages of emotional justice that were designed as resources and tools to support us with our healing. So there's four. As there were four languages of whiteness, four elements that make up the language of whiteness, there are four elements that are emotional justice love languages: intimate reckoning, intimate revolution, resistance negotiation, and revolutionary Black grace. Each one of them has a definition. For the purposes of this presentation, we're going to focus on intimate revolution. Next slide, please. So intimate revolution, this is for Black men globally to unlearn that their sole value is labor and to redefine their relationship to labor and power and normalize rest. It's for Black men to navigate through a traumatized, hypersexualized masculinity by doing their emotional work and unlearning the language of whiteness. The latter too often leads to pouring their untreated trauma over the bodies of Black women. So let's talk about what it means to globally unlearn this value as labor, but also developing an emotional literacy. Next slide, please. So the emotional infrastructure of healing is about doing your emotional work. Doing your emotional work is about developing and sustaining a practice of emotional literacy. The reason why the love language for global Black men is intimate revolution is that we know as a Black people, revolution has always been how we've moved towards liberation. It's been revolutionary activism, revolutionary action. When it comes to healing, intimate revolution is about the internal work that each Black man does, not just individually, but interpersonally and communally, as part of reassigning a full humanity to heal their dehumanization as a result of the systems of oppression that shape all of us. Let's do the next slide, please. So doing the emotional labor of navigating their masculinity, recognizing that this is tender, complex, traumatized, and challenging territory, that Black masculinity is born of the language of whiteness and wrapped in racism, that creates a complex relationship about protection, power, and harm. The Sources of Emotional Justice, a roadmap for racial healing. Next slide, please. Critical point. So much of what we think about when it comes to racism is about education. When it comes to healing, Black men cannot PhD their way out of a legacy of untreated trauma. Nobody can, but for the purposes of this presentation, we're talking specifically about Black masculinity and Black men. It is not a question of your intellectual capacity, your ideological sophistication, or your philosophical practice. The legacy of untreated trauma shapes all of you, irrespective of however educated we become, and therefore the emotional literacy that needs to be developed is right across the board. It's individual, it's interpersonal, it's institutional. Next slide, please. So we are building what we call Moving Masculinity. It's a global lab of narrative change, cultural production, and healing practice whose foundation is emotional justice. So everything that you've heard led us to say, what would it mean to build a tool as a resource that can actually support Black masculinity in doing this emotional work and developing this emotional literacy? This is what we built. Next slide, please. So it is a global structure. You can see the flags, the stars and stripes are there. The Union Jack is there. Ghana is there. South Africa should be in there as well. And you see the images of Black men in between the letters, because it's literally about saying that for a masculinity to be healed, it must be moved. We don't use the language of toxic masculinity. We do use the language in emotional justice of traumatized masculinity. Why? Because a trauma can be healed. Next slide, please. So moving masculinity is resource and refuge. It is a place where Black men can do their emotional work, navigating the tenderness and turmoil of their masculinity in community and through connection. It is also recognizing that it is their work to do, it is no one else's. So often when we've thought about healing and masculinity, it has either been connected to gender justice or violence against women. With moving masculinity and emotional justice, we talk about Black masculinity and its healing as a reassigning of humanity to Black men, period. That it starts with recognizing that as Black men, your humanity is the beginning and a critical part of any process of healing. Before any conversation about anybody else, that the reassigning of humanity, where it has been so systematically stripped, is critical. It's also recognizing that that work must be done in community. Isolation ain't it. We don't heal that way because we never built that way. That's why the phrase is, it takes a village. Next slide, please. So what is your emotional work? That you engage your emotional justice love language, you identify your emotional inheritance, that you explore this tenderness and turmoil in community and through connection, and you develop emotional literacy. Next slide, please. So moving masculinity is about legacy and building. It's not a traditional lab. So we're naming and examining these inherited patterns from harmful systems that shape emotional economy of a masculinity identity, and then designing emotionally healthy alternatives that bridge ancestral tradition with modern media and applied framework. So moving masculinity is both digital and it's living and it's in person. So online, it's what we call a multimedia digital village of sound, memory, film, and story. And when you enter the space, when it launches, it's essentially these four rooms: community, healing, damage, and dreaming. And it's a mix of video, audio, and text. Now, we've heard about the manosphere, this space of grievance and violence and violation where men come together. They are given a target who is responsible for all the wrongs, all the issues that are happening in their world, and that they blame and shame and humiliate and violate in all kinds of horrific ways. The reality about the manosphere, though, is actually it is a community. It is a place where men gather and navigate emotions. Moving masculinity was simply saying, what if we built a different kind of community that was about connection, that enabled the recognition and the articulation of emotions, that supported Black men to develop emotional literacy, but did it in ways that were artistic and creative and activity oriented. That's what moving masculinity is. So you have these four rooms: community, healing, damage, and dreaming. Community are brother notes, brothers talking about loss, regret, vulnerability, shame, grief, power, pain, all in audio. Damage, that's poetry, where a brother navigates the tenderness and turmoil of his particular masculinity as a permission-giving process to invite other brothers to share theirs. And it's called Damage because it's really about the turmoil that exists in identifying and then expressing tenderness in a society that then labels that and negates that as either non-masculine and negates the ability to feel. Healing is a scripted piece where a brother is reckoning with his emotional inheritance, three generations of Black men, him, his father, and his grandfather. And then dreaming is a masculinity affirmation ceremony for Black boys turning 16. And it's really a multi-generational gathering of Black boys and men that's exploring the boy you are and the man you're becoming. And it's exploring the boy you were and the man you became. And it's exchange of Black boys talking about imagination and dreaming and their dreams, and Black men sharing wisdom and lessons about regrets and vulnerability and things that they would change. But the idea is to change the emotional inheritance of a Black masculinity, but do so in a space that is also communal and connective. All of that represents moving masculinity. Next slide, please. So it's this multimedia global digital village, as I've just explained. It really is about exploring Black men's emotional relationship to power, labor, vulnerability, and violation across all of these landscapes, the US, Ghana, UK, and South Africa. So I've been engaging men now for over 10 years. But for this project, we had men from across the US, from the UK, and from Ghana, all of whom participated through conversation, through interview, through voice notes, and this beautiful presentation and exchange of Black men developing an emotional literacy in order to support other Black men to strengthen and develop their emotional literacy. Next slide, please. So it combines these areas. It's the foundation of emotional justice. We modernize and digitize ancestral tradition. That's why it's called the digital village. It recognizes the ancestral tradition of coming together and exploring how we coming together helped us storytell about what was happening. It includes journalism, audio, video, text, and still images. So all of these images you see on the slides all come from the Moving Masculinity site. Next slide, please. So we have an ecosystem ethos that's about saying the systems of harm taught this masculinity of dominion. It's all about control, submission, extraction, harm, and these kind of alpha hero dudes. But a Black masculinity that is about emotional literacy and a reassigning of humanity is always about development. Part of what emotional justice says is we are not going to problematize masculinity. What we are going to talk about is what does it mean to reassign a full humanity to the dehumanized. So that means you build community, develop connection. It's about engagement, a healing practice, and an active humanity. So that's our ecosystem ethos. Next slide, please. So to build emotional infrastructure, which is what Moving Masculinity is doing, requires emotional literacy. To develop emotional literacy means doing your emotional work. And doing your emotional work requires resource and support. And that's what Moving Masculinity is. It's an invitation to do your emotional work, develop the literacy, to build the infrastructure. And that's how we move a masculinity that isn't just taught, it's trapped. That it's about restriction, it's linear, it's limited. And within all of that, there's also always been a masculinity that predates these systems that has been about freedom and development of mind, body, soul, community. And that, the gathering and the bringing together of both the contemporary reality and the legacies of that, and honoring the ancestral tradition so that we recognize a longer historical line, one that is not limited to a post-enslavement, post-colonialism, or enslavement, colonialism, and apartheid era, but also stretches back beyond that. Next slide, please. So we build it. This is the Multimedia Digital Lab that I've just explained. We're offering it through public arts programming, art screening and dialogue, and then we're scaling it. We're developing creative curricula. The idea is to design this fresh future, this masculinity affirmation ceremony for Black boyhood with multi-generational Black men, so that Black men are doing work among and between each other that is healing. And in doing their emotional work, when you return and you're back within your communities, as you do your emotional work, it naturally seeps into and starts to shape your environment, your community, the brotherhoods that you're part of, and what we call the brotherhood of becoming. Next slide, please. It's about the boy you were and the man you became. It is about the boy you might still be and the man you are yet to become. It is really about reassigning this full humanity to a Black masculinity shaped by emotional inheritance, societal expectation, and historical legacy. That's what emotional justice is, a reassigning of a full humanity to this Black masculinity. Next slide, please. So this is the history of what's actually enabled me to create this. It's a long history. I'm just going to take you through it so you can see the foundation that built all of this. Next slide, please. So we have Moving Masculinity is the present project, the foundation it sits on. This is from the United States. This was emotional justice for Black men, exploring vulnerability and the impact of isolation during COVID. Next slide, please. We've always mixed theater, storytelling, and art. So the one on the far left, this is also the States, the US. This is Savior. This was a play exploring masculinity, Black male privilege, exploring how privilege shows up among and between Black men. This was an in-person dialogue as part of a dialogue series that I held over a 5-year period. And then we wanted to talk about consent and how Black masculinity, how Black men learn about consent and how that learning shapes their relationship to their own bodies, as well as to the world. So all of these were in the States. Next slide, please. We also did projects in Ghana. One on the far left is Witness. This was really about hearing from Black men talk about witnessing violence and how what they witnessed shaped them. So often the way that we think about Black masculinity is in relationship to gender justice. And of course, that is an important and critical lens. But in emotional justice, emotional literacy is about each man developing a language to identify and articulate his own panorama of emotions in order to both regulate, manage, and then communicate them. So Witness was about giving, it was about oral histories, 50 men in Accra and in Takoradi in Ghana. Sex and the African Man was about that, consent, culture, patriarchy, and pleasure, looking at how culture shaped notions of consent and how those notions were then enforced and entrenched for Ghanaian men and how that then showed up in places of labor, the workplace in particular. I Am Unlearning was a video series of interviews that was also about really exploring a relationship to power. And then the L Word Ghana was specifically about leadership. Next slide, please. So this was an entire gathering of men exploring how they learned about leadership and how that was shaped and modeled for them by the men in their community. This was continuing to really model this multi-generational, intergenerational conversation among and between men, recognizing that historically, African rites of passage have often separated gender and then invited people to come back together, having done a certain amount of work together. That's part of an ancestral tradition. And what we do is both honor that and integrate it into the work that we do. Next slide, please. So Moving Masculinity is about intimate public conversation. It is unmasking vulnerability, recognizing that vulnerability is not collapse, that it is construction. It's often, though, unseen scaffolding, but it's scaffolding nonetheless. And you can't have a building if you don't have the scaffolding. Next slide, please. Everything that I've just walked you through, all of the elements of it, can be found in this. This is the source where everything that I've spoken about is broken down. And this is my book, Emotional Justice, A Roadmap for Racial Healing. That is what this is all about. Creating a roadmap for a healing that is focused, specific, Black, and in the context of what, and it's in the context of a world that has not simply stripped humanity from Black men, but has denied that that's what has happened, and then created no tools and no resources to reassign that humanity. So that is our work that we do. It's what emotional justice does, is to provide the resource and then say, this is the invitation for you to now then come and do that emotional work. Moving Masculinity will be formally launched in February 2026 here in Ghana. And we're hoping that we'll be coming actually to the University of Michigan, but that's a longer conversation for another time. But we'll certainly be rolling out through public arts programs in the States, in Ghana, and in South Africa. And then the actual site, everything that I've spoken about, will be available in January 2026. So you can go in, listen to voice notes, watch the video, and it has the chat room component that allows you to both talk and engage. So you're not just in community, you're in connection and you're in conversation. And that's the presentation. Thank you so much. Excited about hearing from you all.
Thank you, thank you. I know we're a little bit over time, but I'm certainly going to invite people to hang on to ask questions if they have some. I offer an apology for Jennifer Hamer, who was in class and brought her class to your session, but that class ended on a half an hour, and they couldn't keep the room longer than that. So she has forwarded a couple of questions that the students had, but I will let folks here ask first because I know people may have to depart, and some already have. I know, but if there are any questions here. Please, by all means.
I have a question if anyone can hear me.
Yeah, I'm sorry, whoever was, Mark, go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you. Esther, thank you so much. This was incredible. I've been taking notes the whole time, and I've learned so much. I wanted to know more about revolutionary Black grace. I've never heard that before. Could you please elaborate? Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Mark. So revolutionary Black grace is the emotional justice love language of the global Black world. And it's a very specific thing. It is about recognizing that, unlearning that the language of whiteness taught all of us that American Blackness is criminal and that African Blackness is wretched. And the intention of that learning was to keep us separate, to sustain a segregated Blackness, because a segregated Blackness will always serve white supremacy. Revolutionary Black grace was about saying, our Blackness has been expanded as a result of the systems of harm that have shaped all of us, the legacy of enslavement, colonialism, and apartheid. That expansion means that there is a distinctness to each of our Blacknesses, whether you're Black in Britain, Black in America, Black in Ghana, Black in South Africa, there is a distinctness to your Blackness, but there's also connective tissue. Revolutionary Black grace is inviting us to recognize and honor the distinctness, but also recognize the connection so that we extend to each other a grace that is specifically Black in the context of a contemporary history that has shaped all of us, but that is revolutionary because revolution has always been the way that we've moved forward from spaces of harm to any element of freedom. So it's about a healing between and among us as global Black people in a love language that is specific to us. So it is a grace that is specifically Black and specifically revolutionary. And it is about how we then engage each other as global Black people. So often in Ghana, people talk about the fiscal economy of investment with all of the return. In emotional justice, we talk about the emotional economy of our identity as global Black people. And without healing the emotional economy, whatever we think that we're going to build is not going to be sustained. We see it in movements that implode, not because of an absence of thought or philosophy or work, but the emotional relationship to Blackness is the thing that needs healing. That's what that is for, the love language of that.
And Jalen, I'm going to give you the last question, and I'm going to talk to Esther offline about the class that wanted to get some feedback. Jalen, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you again for this presentation. It's really great to receive this because right now I am currently a fifth-year PhD at Georgia State University here in Atlanta, where I'm studying and interviewing Black men on how they are constructing or how they have constructed their masculinity and manhood here. And what I found just in the, just in the atmosphere and the zeitgeist, in the last few years is how a lot of Black men struggle with defining and actually outlining the difference between their emotional expressions and understanding of their masculinity and the construction of their manhood and how those things work in tandem as they navigate this spaces of white supremacy. So I asked the question of what have you gathered from interviewing and engaging with Black men globally in terms of how they've come to understand and express and make sense of their masculinity as they are trying to maximize and optimize what it means to be a Black man wholly through this work.
Thank you, Jalen. Alfred, I wonder, could we take Ekaria, I think, has a hand up. Could we
Please,
take
yes,
Jalen
yes.
and I can respond? Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Ekaria, do you want to go?
Yeah, thank you so much for this. This is really, really amazing. I'm a master's student studying Pan-African studies right now, and so I really appreciated the global lens that you apply to Blackness. I just wanted to ask, and this is very quick, if we had questions or we wanted to engage with your work further, I just wanted to know, was there a paper that this book is based off of? Is there a way we can reach out to you? That sort of thing.
Sure. So as I said, the last slide, the entire presentation is based on the book. The book is called Emotional Justice, A Roadmap for Racial Healing. I think maybe somebody can pop the link in there so that folks want to get it, they can. Maybe somebody can do that whilst I'm speaking. There's also the website where you can engage my work. I'm going to put the website in myself because then that's easy. This is an email to engage the team at I lead an organization called the Armah Institute of Emotional Justice. That's where we develop all the resources, and I work with a global team that's here in Ghana, in Chicago, and in the UK. We develop projects, training, and thought leadership. And so we are always developing resources in order to offer things to the community in specific ways. So I hope that answers that question. In terms of Jalen, I think it's a really interesting question. In emotional justice, we differentiate between an intellectual understanding of Blackness, Black manhood, and Black masculinity, and an emotional relationship to your Blackness. And the reason we differentiate is because you can nurture a political relationship to your Blackness and your Black masculinity that understands how systems of oppression shape you and have shaped the world. But the emotional connection to your Blackness and to your masculinity is often less clearly articulated because it is rooted in a combination of lived experience and what I call the emotional inheritance, for which we often haven't developed language. And so part of the work that we're doing with emotional justice, it's less about definition. That's why the project is simply called Moving Masculinity. It's also why we don't use the language of toxic masculinity, but we use the language of traumatized masculinity as it relates to Black men. And that's also really important. Black masculinity is traumatized. White masculinity is 100% toxic. Different thing, different conversation. And so those specificities are really critical. So it's less about an intellectual understanding of how they construct it and more about saying what is the emotional literacy that you have that enables you to navigate your Black masculinity. And in identifying that emotional literacy, how does that transform not your masculinity, but your humanity? Because ultimately, the emotional justice framework is saying that the acts of shaping Black masculinity has been about the stripping of humanity. So a healing masculinity is about reassigning a full humanity to folks who've been dehumanized in a particular way. In that space, it enables there to be room to actually center Black masculinity without centering patriarchy, because we're actually connecting it to humanity and not to the ways that white masculinity has required the entire world genuflect at its kind of emotional craziness, to coin a phrase. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. I think that is a perfect point to end. I want to thank everybody for putting up with the technical challenges in the beginning. I thank and absentia those that had to depart early, one to teach, and one I know has a research center and a staff meeting that was overlapping with this. So we lost a bit of our crowd early, but I think they got the gist of what was going on. And I'm grateful for you opening up our consideration of Black masculinities, getting to the global, getting beyond the toxic, giving us conceptual tools and ideas to think more deeply and broadly about the pursuit of a healthy Black masculinity. So thank you for joining us today, and thank you for everyone for being a part of the conversation.
My pleasure. Happy so many people showed up. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Liz. Oh, kind phrases coming up on the chat room. I appreciate that. Thanks, Jalen. Take care. I see some South Africans in the house. That's always lovely to see as well.
And I received several messages directly from people, one apologizing for leaving earlier, and the questions really, I think you answered them in the book. So Jennifer Hammer had an undergraduate class, so some very basic but important questions. One having to do with what does it feel like to be a self-identified woman invested in the project of Black masculinity. So I'm sure you probably answered that several thousand times, but that was percolating in Professor Hamer's student group. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's asked a lot. And people always are surprised by my answer, because my answer is rooted in ancestral tradition. And in ancestral tradition, men and women have always shaped each other. It's in contemporary spaces where this idea, because the question is rarely asked simply as a question. There's an underlying philosophy that's basically like, what right do you have to be speaking about shit to do with brothers? That's basically what's being, asked. And then often what people say is, well, Black men have been speaking about women forever. But actually my answer is much more rooted in the ancestry of what shapes this work. And in the ancestry of what shapes this work, I'm born of two tribes. And both tribes, men shape women and women shape men. It's part of how we move. It's different than saying each does the other's work. No. The emotional work is yours to do, but the shaping of it, the developing of resource to support that, can be done by either gender. And the last thing I would say is that in the ancestral sense, that you don't gender humanity. And what masculinity has done, particularly Black masculinity, not just Black masculinity, but masculinity has done is to racialize emotion and then deny them to an entire group of people, causing not just destabilization and dehumanization, but deep cycles of trauma that just remain untreated. And they will remain untreated until we reassign a humanity back. And nobody's going to do that other than Black folk. Nobody's invested. Nobody cares to do it. It serves too much of what helps white supremacy flourish. So it's our work to do, for sure.